Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the unholy case of the Plantation Triplets the masters could not control that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled, and if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder. Don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. There are certain histories that refuse to be written down. They are not recorded by ink and ledger, nor are they contained by stone or silence. They exist in the unsteady space between a whispered memory and a profound, unexplained absence. Our focus tonight is on one such history, an event so resistant to documented closure that it remains less a case study and more a perpetual, low-frequency haunting that persists even now beneath the weeds and shadows of Mississippi. This is the narrative of Hollow Creek, a plantation nestled deep within the unforgiving soil, where the cruelest act was not merely the crack of the whip, but the attempt to achieve absolute erasure to annihilate not just life, but the very memory of it. Yet, Hollow Creek is remembered today not for the success of that erasure, but for its utter, terrifying failure. A failure that birthed a legend. The master, the overseers, the entire system of bondage, all were designed to impose a comprehensive silence upon those enslaved, but against the three smallest children. This silence failed spectacularly. The story we investigate begins not with the terror, but with the aftermath, the great mystery that defines this case. Sometime after the sweltering summer of 1848, three young girls, born into bondage and known only by the collective whisper of their anomaly, disappeared without leaving a single track. They were not found in the surrounding swamps, where the cypress roots twist like gnarled hands, nor were they discovered concealed in the dense timberline, a refuge that swallowed many escapees. They simply vanished from a fortified cellar, a cold stone prison designed to hold them completely still and completely silent. There was no broken lock, no forced entry, no open door. They departed in a way that violated every known law of physics and authority. The masters, in their desperation, tried to bury the event. They claimed accident, coincidence, or successful flight, anything to explain the inexplicable loss of human property. They failed. Their failure is proven by a fragile, burned remnant of evidence discovered decades later, far from the suffocating cotton fields of Hollow Creek. It was a fragment of a private journal, its paper scorched around the edges, its ink blurred by water or fire, belonging to one of the visiting physicians. Most of the handwriting had dissolved into illegibility. The notes on medical anomalies and strange acoustic phenomena lost forever. But one sentence, one defiant, terrifying declaration remained. It was underlined twice, the ink heavy enough to nearly tear through the fragile page. A frantic insistence against all reason: they do not die. This fragment represents the core of the mystery, a life that could not be contained by captivity, and a death that could not be confirmed by history. This is the enduring warning of Hollow Creek. This is the genesis of an unholy legend, the legacy of a silence that was broken only by a persistent, deep, unearthly hum that lingers like smoke that will not clear. To understand how three children could become an enduring supernatural symbol of defiance, a force that unsettled the very foundation of ownership, we must first examine the environment built with the singular purpose of crushing them. Hollow Creek was established decades prior, not merely as a farm, but as a chilling monument to the tyranny of documentation. The world of the plantation was defined by the ledger, those thick, leather-bound books that served as the master's true constitution. Here, life was not merely property, it was a line item, a capital asset, quantified by its capacity for labor and its monetary value. Every birth, every death, every ration given, and every punishment exacted was meticulously recorded. The overseers and the master himself were obsessed with these records, for they were the legal, social, and psychological justification for the entire system. By reducing human beings to entries, by replacing names with numbers and humanity with numerical value, they sought to eliminate the moral burden of ownership. This was a place where humanity was intentionally reduced to ink. But some things were deemed too unsettling, too anomalous, or too shamefully cruel to appear even in the private books. And for those things, there was the cellar, located directly beneath the central manor house. The cellar was a deliberate architectural statement of cold, isolated authority. It was a space entirely cut off from the light, built not with manageable brick, but with massive, irregular slabs of cold, unyielding fieldstone quarried from the creek bed itself. The air down there was perpetually damp and silent, carrying the mineral tang of the earth and the deep cold that seemed to sink into the marrow of anyone who descended. It was not a root cellar for storing provisions. It was a confinement chamber. The low-ceilinged space featured heavy, hand-forged iron rings bolted deep into the stone walls, with short, thick lengths of chain designed not for work, but specifically to hold captives still and quiet. It was the place where the master dealt with the ungovernable, the acts of resistance or the psychological anomalies that could not be solved with a simple flogging in the open air. It was a surgical theater for the soul. This cellar represented the master's hidden, ultimate authority, the domain of his strongest arm of control, the overseer Harlan Price. Harlan was a brute of legendary cruelty, a man whose physical presence was defined by the acrid scent of sweat, old blood, and polished leather. He was a creature of singular, uncomplicated violence, embodying the physical oppression of the system. He acted as a necessary counterbalance to the master's facade of administrative control. When the ledgers failed to impose obedience, when the simple calculation of profit and loss broke down against human will, Harlan was the final, inescapable instrument of coercion. He took a perverse pride in his ability to subdue, to reduce a person to silent, compliant fear. It was into this very nexus of stone, silence, and absolute, documented violence that the three sisters were introduced an environment designed to contain everything, yet utterly defeated by nothing. The year was 1845. In the suffocating heat of a late summer, the birth of the triplets was immediately deemed a problem, an omen of instability in a system that demanded predictability. To the master, a single child was a measurable piece of property. 3 identical infants, simultaneously born, was an anomaly, an unsettling multiplication of an already volatile variable. The system was based on division and separation, not perfect unity. The master, who viewed the world through the lens of accounting, saw the collective identity of the identical girls as a direct threat to the individualization of control. The mother, whose grief-stricken existence was also reduced to an entry in the household book, was immediately stripped of her children. The master feared the potential for collective rebellion, and perhaps more fundamentally, he feared the unknown. The triplets let us use the secret. Defiant names their mother whispered in the dark Clara. Selah and Serenity were taken almost immediately to the stone cellar. Their confinement was swift and total, aimed at stripping them of all human connection and spirit before they could develop language or conscious defiance. The master's goal was to ensure they understood, through pain and isolation, that their identities were separate, measurable, and owned. Yet, from the very beginning, something was deeply, unnervingly wrong with the nature of their captivity. The girls were subjected to the same deprivations and sensory overload that broke the strongest men. They were isolated, left hungry, and eventually exposed to the threats that Harlan Price administered. But the triplets offered no conventional emotional response. There were no outbursts of desperate weeping, no pleading screams that might signal submission, no fits of rage that could be physically exhausted. Instead, they replaced all conventional human reaction with a sound that would soon define Hollow Creek, the humming. It began as a low, almost subsonic tone, steady and persistent. It wasn't melodic in the sense of a song, but rather three distinct, perfectly braided tones that rose together. These tones were mathematically precise and inhumanly sustained, never wavering in pitch or rhythm, regardless of the surrounding noise or punishment. According to the few, hushed fragments of later testimony from the field, it was more a vibration, a tangible pressure that resonated through the dense fieldstone of the floor, up through the very foundations of the manor, and into the air. The master, initially dismissive, grew increasingly frantic. He had employed every psychological tactic the system afforded isolation: hunger, the deliberate use of Harlan Price's intimidating presence. But the girls remained impervious. The humming became a persistent, low-grade white noise of defiance, a sound that communicated not terror, but an unsettling, inexplicable self-containment and unity. They had replaced the expected sound of human anguish with a unified, mechanical sound of resistance. The master, pacing the floorboards above the stone prison, felt the vibration through his boots, and his dread grew with every passing day. He realized, with a chilling terror, that he could whip the flesh, but he could not touch the unified spirit. He could control the physical space, but he could not capture the sound. The triplets had begun to resist before they had even learned to speak, turning their confinement into an echo chamber for a sound the entire plantation was utterly unprepared to absorb, foreshadowing a catastrophe no ledger could ever account for. The failure of the lash, the failure of isolation, and the failure of basic human psychology to subdue the triplets left the master with a pressing problem. The humming had become a palpable threat to his authority. It was a constant, low-frequency reminder of his absolute lack of control over the contents of his own dungeon. Driven by both shame and terror, the master sought to legitimize the anomaly, to have it categorized, treated, and therefore neutralized. This marked the inciting conflict the moment the private terror of the cellar was reluctantly exposed to the outside world, inviting in the cold, logical gaze of science. The master reached out to a small circle of medical professionals in the nearby towns, men of learning but shallow experience. Framing the situation as an unusual case of nervous disorder among his enslaved property, he invited several physicians to observe the girls. providing them with lodgings and a generous fee. Desperate for an official diagnosis that would restore order and sanity to his world, the physicians arrived with their polished steel instruments, their dated theories of humors, and their condescending assurance that the issue could be solved with proper regimen and discipline. They approached the cellar with the confidence of men accustomed to the absolute control of the ailing human body, only for that confidence to quickly fracture, not through compassion, but through sheer, measurable anomaly. According to the fragments of the medical reports, the same reports the master would later attempt to suppress and destroy, the doctors spent weeks in baffled, frantically perplexed observation. They meticulously catalogued the girls' physical health, finding them surprisingly robust and perfectly nourished despite the conditions. A clear contradiction to the typical emaciation of a confined spirit. The true subject of their study was the sound. They deployed their meager 19th century acoustic tools, not designed for such precision, and recorded the hum not as a vocalization, but as a quantifiable, physical effect. One of the more meticulous physicians, Dr. Wallace, noted in his remaining papers that the tone was comprised of 3 perfectly consonant frequencies, sustained with an inhuman regularity. He even attempted to chart the specific notes, concluding they were notes of defiance, a perfect, unwavering C minor chord held infinitely. It did not waver with sleep, hunger, or fear. Dr. Wallace described it less as singing and more as a focused sonic disturbance, a term that lacked medical meaning but captured the psychological reality of the sound. He and the others began experiencing debilitating, rhythmic headaches, a strange, persistent internal ringing in their own ears that mirrored the cellar's tone, and an unsettling inability to achieve deep sleep whenever they were within the manor house. The master had sealed the cellar to contain the girls, but the stone, they realized, was not containing the sound. It was acting as a bizarre, cold-sounding board, projecting the resonance through the very foundations and into the air of the master's sanctuary. The failure of the physicians was not a gentle retreat. It was a panicked flight. The conflict shifted from a battle of wills to a battle of acoustics and sanity. The scientific community failed to provide a rational explanation or a conventional cure. Their final collective report was less a medical opinion and more an indictment of the master's brutality, a convenient evasion of their own professional failure. They did not suggest the children were possessed, but rather that their inhuman response was a symptom of the intolerable conditions. This moral judgment was not delivered out of compassion, but out of professional embarrassment. They could not explain the humming. Therefore, they blamed the environment. They departed Hollow Creek with a speed bordering on self-preservation, leaving the master even more isolated in the sound of the triplets' defiance ringing louder than ever. The failure of logic and medicine signaled a frightening truth. The problem wasn't medical, it was existential, an expression of unified defiance that transcended the physical. The master, now abandoned by external authority and professional validation, felt the walls of his control close in. The humming was an omnipresent reminder of his loss of mastery, an invisible, shaming device that permeated his expensive carpets and fine furniture. In his escalating, isolated panic, he turned to his final, most reliable instrument, Harlan Price. Harlan, the overseer, represented raw, untethered physical violence. He was the only force on the plantation designed to conquer through pure, overwhelming trauma. He was the master's shadow self, immune to reason or guilt. The master sent Harlan into the cellar with a single, desperate mandate: subdue the children, break the sound, and restore the necessary silence, regardless of the cost. The master was willing to sacrifice the property if it meant silencing the terrifying, acoustic declaration of their freedom. Harlan descended the cold steps with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed only in the tactile world. He had never met a resistance he could not flatten. The air inside the cellar was thick and wet, carrying the stench of confinement, but the sound was strangely dry, a resonant pressure that immediately settled against his eardrums. He initiated his discipline, fully expecting the humming to shatter instantly into screams of pain and submission, the expected chorus of human defeat that always accompanied his work. But the sound did not break. The event that followed marked the climax of the physical conflict and the terrifying unveiling of the true kinetic power of the triplets' unified resistance. As Harlan's deliberate, focused brutality escalated as the physical threats increased in frequency and viciousness, the three perfect tones of the humming did not diminish. They surged. They did not become louder in conventional volume, but increased exponentially in intensity and pitch, a high, razor-sharp frequency that felt less like an auditory sensation and more like an internal, physical force. Harlan, the man immune to the pleas and suffering of others, suddenly felt an unfamiliar, crushing pressure build behind his eyes and beneath his ribs. According to the later, terrifying accounts whispered among the enslaved, the sound began to cut through the skin of the air. It felt, they claimed, like a perfectly tuned saw blade operating on the marrow of the bone, vibrating the very calcium within the body. Harlan staggered back, dropping his whip. The pressure was not merely deafening, it was physically incapacitating. The overseer, the very embodiment of plantation control, clutched his chest, his face contorting in a silent agony that was not caused by a punch or a blow, but by an acoustic phenomenon he could neither fight nor flee. He found his limbs seized by a sudden, inexplicable tremor, his movements reduced to spastic futility. The girls, meanwhile, did not move. Their eyes were wide, and the hum remained perfect and sustained. The humming became the perfect, non-violent weapon of the oppressed, a unified sound of inner resistance so complete that it manifested as a physical barrier. Harlan Price, the terror of Hollow Creek, stumbled out of the cellar that afternoon with a face bleach white, his immense physical strength momentarily reduced to palsy. He was incapable of coherent speech, capable only of a series of choked, rattling gasps and a silent, profound terror. He had met a force that defied his brutal tactile world, a defiance that resonated from the spirit directly into the physical realm. This represented the midpoint climax of the tragedy, the moment the physical dominance of the master's system was definitively overthrown by an unknown spiritual or acoustic power. The collapse of Harlan Price was a shock that rippled through the plantation's entire power structure. Harlan, the unshakable brute, was found later that night, curled into a fetal position in his small cabin, incoherent and terrified by the very silence that followed the incident. Within 3 days, Harlan was gone. There was no struggle, no body found in the swamps, and certainly no grave dug. The master, shaken to his core, simply reported that Harlan had abandoned his post, a flimsy lie that fooled no one but the distant authorities. The rumor among the field hands, passed in hushed, reverent tones, was that the overseer had been swallowed whole by the terrifying darkness of the cellar itself, consumed by the same psychological silence he had attempted to impose. The field hands did not rejoice in Harlan's demise. They recoiled in sheer awe and fear of the terrible power that now resided beneath the manor. The disappearance of Harlan Price and the utter physical defeat of his violence triggered a rapid, profound shift in the atmosphere of Hollow Creek. The system of control began to visibly fracture. The remaining overseers, unnerved by the fate of their strongest colleague and perpetually on edge from the lingering sense of the humming, grew cautious, and their routine cruelty waned. They avoided the manor, refusing to go near the cellar door, which the master now kept triple locked. The true system collapse, however, was demonstrated in the master's sanctum, the ledger. The master, whose identity was inextricably linked to the precise, inhuman order of his books, began to lose his grip. The once meticulously maintained pages suddenly became sparse, riddled with gaps and erratic entries. Days would pass with no record of labor, food distribution, or purchases, a breakdown of the economic framework itself. The master's usually precise, authoritarian script became shaky and smudged, often dissolving into illegible blotches when he was forced to enter a detail near the girl's location. It was as if the act of documenting his continuing ownership, of recording the brutality, had itself become a physical, painful task that his hand now instinctively resisted. He attempted to fight the vibration with physical alterations, ordering heavy woolen carpets to be packed against the cellar door, and even trying to hang tapestries from the floorboards above futile attempts to muffle an internal, spiritual defiance. He was actively failing to maintain the illusion of administrative control, the last pillar of his authority. Worse, the ledger, that cold record of property, began to betray him. The entries became subtly descriptive, emotional betrayals of the master's panic, where a page should have listed cotton yields. The master had frantically scribbled, "The silence is worse than the noise. The earth will not hold them." He was starting to document his fear, not his assets. This complete fracturing of the documentary system proved that the chilling vacuum left by the three silent, defiant children was not a simple void. It was a potent psychological threat. The master's world, built on control and documentation, was dissolving into chaos and paranoia, all because of a perfectly sustained hum he could not comprehend. The true conflict, the battle between arbitrary human authority and an unexplained, unified resistance, had just begun to climax. The collapse of the documentary system was the psychological precursor to a far more destructive material collapse. The master's frantic attempts to silence the cellar had failed, but his paranoia had inadvertently created the irrefutable evidence that would drag his private terror into the light of public scrutiny. The sound may have been subjective, but the consequence was undeniably physical. The turning point was the discovery of Harlan Price's ledger, not the master's official record, but Harlan's own private, crude pocketbook, a filthy document of personal violence and petty tally marks. It was found not on the plantation, but in the possession of a local constable who had been tasked with locating the missing overseer. The constable, an uninterested man of simple ambition, only saw a mundane record of debt collection. But a young, newly appointed county clerk, a man named Elias Thorne, driven by an almost pathological dedication to record keeping, recognized the chaotic scribbles of a mind under duress. Thorne noted that the entries detailing the brutal disciplinary actions against the three girls abruptly stopped on the day dear Harlan staggered out of the cellar. Immediately following this last entry were several pages of frantic, almost childlike drawings and symbols, spiraling coils, perfect circles drawn with a compass-like regularity, and a repeated, single word scratched so deep it nearly tore the page concord. This term, meaning agreement or harmony, was profoundly out of place in Harlan's ledger of discord. Thorne, initially searching for a financial trail, instead found a psychological signature, the precise, unified nature of the girl's acoustic attack, translated into the geometric insanity of a broken mind. This document, this small, filthy piece of evidence, confirmed what the whispers had claimed Harlan Price had not run. He had been mentally annihilated by an incomprehensible force, and his last coherent act was drawing the shapes of the sound that consumed him. But the most damning piece of concrete evidence emerged from the very walls of the manor. The master, in his final, desperate act of containment, had instructed a carpenter to tightly seal the cellar door with heavy crossbeams and a secondary lining of sound-dampening felt. The carpenter, a free black man from a neighboring town, later gave testimony. As he worked, he discovered something tucked into the rough stone and mortar near the floor, a small, tightly folded piece of linen, scorched on one corner. Inside, protected from the elements, were 3 perfect, child-size handprints, made not with dirt or grime, but with dried, concentrated blood. These handprints were arranged in an unnervingly specific pattern, one centered, and the other 2 equidistant and slightly lower, forming a perfect resonant triangle. Forensic reports confirmed that the blood belonged to the master's wife, who had died mysteriously in the house years before, an event officially recorded as a fever. The handprints, however, suggested a violent struggle or a deliberate, ritualistic contact with the stone of the cellar wall. The presence of her blood, preserved at the epicenter of the master's hidden terror, directly challenged the official narrative of a death. The carpenter's discovery was the physical fulcrum upon which the entire case pivoted, transforming the supernatural mystery of the humming into a tangible case of documented murder and hidden cruelty. The master's elaborate silence had become his undoing, the stone of the cellar itself acting as a forensic witness. The simultaneous discovery of Harlan's Concord ledger and the bloody handprints connecting the current anomaly to a past cover-up sent a catastrophic wave through the fragile social order of the county. The master, already consumed by the paranoia that the humming had installed, did not wait for official arrest. The collapse began in the solitude of his parlor, witnessed only by the cold, damp ledger and the rhythmic pulse of the absence beneath his floorboards. The master's mind, once a finely tuned mechanism of calculation and control, unraveled with terrifying speed. He did not confess to the authorities. He confessed to the ledger. The scribbled entries in his book escalated from fear to a complete, hallucinatory admission of guilt, a terrifying dialogue with the 3 voices he believed were still resonating through the house. He detailed, in a trembling script that eventually broke down into pure charcoal smears, the true scope of his atrocity. The master's paranoia wasn't just about control, it was about lineage. The 3 girls were indeed his children, born of his wife's enslaved maidservant, a betrayal of both the racial hierarchy and his marital vows. But his cruelty went deeper. The 3 children had a terrible, beautiful link to their mother. After the mother, already broken by years of servitude, died from a mysterious sickness, a sickness the master admitted in the ledger was caused by his own neglect and a deliberate refusal of treatment, the master discovered a bizarre phenomenon. Every time he attempted to enter the mother's name into the death records, the ink would dry and immediately crack, leaving a white space. He had tried to erase her memory, but her name refused to be documented. His terror reached a fever pitch when the triplets were born. Not merely identical, but possessing an unnerving acoustic unity that mirrored his wife's singing voice, a voice he had hated and silenced. He realized that the children were the undocumented, resonant memory of their mother, a defiance that could not be killed because it was already a ghost. The master's confession in the ledger continued to reveal the motive behind the cellar. The confinement was not merely punishment for their defiance. It was a desperate surgical attempt to separate the frequencies, to break the acoustic bond that united them and connected them to their mother's spirit. The goal was to fracture their identity into three controllable, documentable pieces of property. This was the ultimate, horrifying twist of the entire case. The master was trying to commit a spiritual abortion, to kill the ghost of the mother living within the bodies of her children. The height of the terror came when the master confessed to what happened to the master's wife. The forensic reports and the bloodied handprints were correct. The master's wife had not died of fever. She had witnessed the master's brutality against the triplets' mother and, in a brief moment of agonized moral clarity, attempted to release the children's mother from her confinement. The master, fearing the exposure of his crimes and his hypocrisy, had struck his wife down in the stairwell leading to the cellar, then staged her death as an illness. The blood on the stone was her own, a silent, final testament to the hidden acts of violence that founded Hollow Creek. The terrifying realization was that the true evil was not the supernatural humming, but the master's calculated, systemic brutality, which was so profound it had summoned the supernatural as a form of moral judgment. The public revelation of the ledger's contents, a frantic, detailed, and utterly self-incriminating document, made a formal legal case unnecessary. The master was found by the constable and Elias Thorne in the early hours of a cold morning, huddled in the center of the parlor, rocking gently, his expensive clothing soiled. His eyes were wide, vacant, staring directly at the floorboards above the cellar, and his mouth was moving in a frantic, soundless imitation of the humming. He was arrested immediately, charged with the murder of his wife, the systematic cruelty toward the enslaved population, and the disappearance of Harlan Price, though the latter charge was more a formality to appease public panic. The trial itself was a perverse spectacle, a final confrontation between the documented world of law and the psychological reality of the plantation. The ledger, presented as the key exhibit, became the voice of the dead, detailing crimes that even the master's wealthy peers found impossible to defend. The master was convicted and sentenced to hang, an ending that should have provided closure. But there was no true closure for Hollow Creek. The legal consequence addressed the master's crimes against the documented world, but failed entirely to account for the three missing girls. The master, even on the gallows, offered no explanation for their disappearance, only repeating the phrase he had scratched into his book: "The earth will not hold them." The immediate social fallout was swift and total. The community, desperate to distance itself from the horror and the revelation of the master's moral corruption, immediately began the process of tearing Hollow Creek apart. The manor house was burned to the ground, a frantic, futile effort to destroy the source of the psychological blight. The remaining enslaved people were dispersed among neighboring plantations or sold further south, their existence violently displaced. But the scattering only served to spread the legend of the triplets, ensuring that the story would not die with the master. The profound contrast between the brutal finality of the master's death and the ethereal persistence of the humming defined the site for generations to come. Hollow Creek became a physical metaphor for the system's fatal flaw. It could enforce life and death, but it could not dictate memory or silence. Today, only the cold, unyielding fieldstone foundation of the cellar remains a shallow, black pit in the earth, perpetually damp and strangely resistant to the sun. Even now, on quiet nights, visitors claim that if you stand directly above the spot where the master's ledger lay, you can feel a low, rhythmic vibration beneath your feet. It is not the sound of a haunting. It is the perfect, unwavering C minor chord of resistance. The sound of three sisters whose final act of defiance was to become an undocumented, resonant memory, a permanent, unerasable truth burned into the very ground where they were meant to be forgotten. The master had tried to murder a ghost. Instead, he made one that resonated through the earth itself. The legal resolution of the master's crimes, the public hanging. The burning of the manor offered a superficial purification to the county, a quick, violent scrubbing of the surface rot. But beneath the scorched earth of Hollow Creek, the psychological and economic foundations of the entire operation proved far more difficult to dismantle. The land itself, tainted by the deep cruelty and now the unnerving mystery of the disappearance, refused to be easily integrated back into the orderly world of documented assets. The subsequent economic and social collapse and reshaping centered on the legal status of the remaining property. The land, fertile and valuable, was quickly seized by the master's distant cousins, men who sought to capitalize on the tragedy while minimizing the stigma. They approached the rebuilding with a cynical detachment, attempting to clear the ground not merely of physical debris, but of the toxic memory. They ordered the foundation stone of the cellar, the very vessel of the triplets' defiance, to be pulled up and dispersed, hoping to silence the vibration once and for all. But the stone resisted. According to historical notes from the period, the labor required to break apart the heavy fieldstone was disproportionately intense. Tools shattered, ropes frayed, and the ground around the foundation remained oddly saturated, almost resisting the dry heat of the summer sun. The workers, many of whom were brought in from outside the county and were ignorant of the whispers, quickly developed a debilitating non-specific ailment, a dizzying nausea accompanied by the persistent internal ringing that Dr. Wallace had once described. They eventually abandoned the task, leaving the foundation intact, a testament to the enduring resistance of the site. The cousins' attempts to sell or even mortgage the property were continuously frustrated. Legal records show that the property's value, once astronomical, plummeted to zero within 18 months of the master's execution. No bank would finance construction on a site so fundamentally unstable. No buyer would assume the deed to land that seemed to reject any attempt at ownership. Official surveyor notes from that time mention a profound gravimetric anomaly near the cellar pit, causing compasses to spin wildly, a subtle, persistent signal that the land itself had become an anomalous force, defying the very laws of property and navigation that the master had built his empire upon. This economic isolation was a form of justice more complete than the law provided. The land of Hollow Creek became useless to the very system that had created its horrors. This physical failure of demolition solidified the area's new, dark identity. The neighboring plantations, desperate to maintain the illusion of their own orderly control, quickly distanced themselves, economically isolating the remaining Hollow Creek land. The collapse was finalized not by law, but by superstition and economic fear. No one wanted to buy the crops grown on the resonant soil. No one wanted to risk the strange sickness that accompanied the sound. The land, once a symbol of immense wealth and power, became an unpurchasable blight, transforming into a desolate, unclaimed scar on the face of the county records. The physical ground had successfully repelled the forces that sought to control and exploit it, achieving a lasting independence through sheer, terrifying reputation. The master's lineage faded into obscurity, but the triplets' resonance became the dominant narrative of the region, warping local geography and commerce around a single, unmovable truth. Some memories cannot be paved over. The haunting legacy was not confined to the land. It was embedded in the scattered lives of the witnesses. Elias Thorne, the county clerk whose dedication to documentation had unveiled the atrocity, never recovered from his exposure to the master's final, deranged entries in the ledger. He became obsessed with the concept of undocumented memory, those lives erased by the system, like the triplets' mother whose name refused to be held by ink. Thorne realized that the true tragedy was not just the violence, but the systematic erasure of identity that preceded it. His subsequent life became a quiet, tireless crusade against the void of the historical record. Thorne spent the remainder of his life as a self-appointed, quiet archivist, not of official county records, but of the oral histories of the plantation's survivors. He meticulously recorded the fragmented songs, the whispered rumors, and the precise details of the children's hum. He was attempting to perform a retroactive documentation, giving voice to those whom the master had tried to silence entirely. Historians note that Thorne's work, preserved in a separate, unofficial archive, became the key to understanding the full psychological horror of Hollow Creek, a deeper record than any court transcript could provide. His legacy proved that the truth, once freed from the shackles of official documentation, finds its own resonant form of preservation. He even attempted to transcribe the humming itself, using primitive musical notation to chart the frequency and duration of the C minor chord, classifying it not as noise, but as a deliberate static piece of acoustic art. His personal notes contain feverish attempts to harmonize the sound with surviving fragments of lullabies sung on the plantation, seeking to prove that the hum was a continuation of the mother's song, an eternal refrain of sorrow and resistance. The fate of the three sisters themselves remains the profound, echoing, unanswered question at the core of the narrative. They were never found, no bodies, no evidence of escape, no witness to their final moments. Their disappearance was complete, a final, perfect act of vanishing that defied the very human need for closure and documentation. The only testimony regarding their final moments came from the master's own ledger, which alluded to a profound, instantaneous transformation, a moment where the children's defiance became so perfectly unified that they ceased to exist in a physical state, becoming pure sound. The most enduring mystery that arose from the ashes was the continued existence of the C minor resonance. If the master had succeeded in killing the girls, why did the sound persist? Seemingly anchored to the fieldstone foundation, the sound became a subject of philosophical debate among early paranormal investigators and local folklorists. The residual psychic trauma theory, favored by early psychological societies, argued the hum was a manifestation of the collective suffering and guilt of the county, an immaterial wound on the societal mind. However, local folklorists and the scattered survivors of the plantation favored a far more terrifying concept, the corporeal transformation theory. This belief posited that the girls, through their unified act of acoustic defiance, had literally converted their physical beings into the energy of the sound itself. They hadn't died. They had transcended the prison of the flesh, becoming an unbreakable wave of resonant energy, literally resonating with the earth, thereby fulfilling the master's desperate fear that the ground would not hold them. They became the sound of the resistance, a permanent, self-sustaining monument to their mother's undocumented memory. The story of Hollow Creek serves not just as a historical chronicle of a singular atrocity, but as a chilling philosophical conclusion on the nature of control, memory, and the unseen resilience of the human spirit. It forces us to confront the profound contrast between the cold, quantifiable evidence of human evil, the ledger, the blood, the gallows, and the ethereal, unquantifiable nature of freedom. The master relied on the power of documentation, the written record, and the physical walls to define reality. Yet, his destruction was ultimately brought about by a sound, an acoustic truth that could not be written, could not be contained, and could not be silenced. This is the ultimate, haunting irony. The master, the documentarian of death and ownership, was destroyed by a force that existed entirely outside the paper trails of his control. His meticulous records proved his crimes, but the absence of a record for the triplets proved his failure. The very notion of silence became the ultimate deception. The master believed silence represented control. The successful erasure of the enslaved memory. Instead, the profound silence that followed the master's hanging the vacuum where the girls once were was filled by the memory of their sound. A silent promise of defiance that echoes in the vibration of the earth itself. The C minor chord is not sadness. It is the perfect pitch of righteous permanence. It stands as a perpetual counter-argument to the narrative of the oppressor. A living monument forged not of stone or bronze, but of pure, unbroken acoustic truth. The question then remains, what does it truly mean to achieve justice or find closure when the victims themselves have transcended the very mechanisms of law and physics that sought to oppress them? The legal system brought the master to justice, but the triplets achieved freedom by dissolving into the fabric of reality, a liberation that the legal and economic system could neither grant nor take away. Historians, sociologists, and folklorists continue to study the Hollow Creek case, not for the simple documentation of murder, but for the lesson it embeds in the soil that the deepest truths often refuse to be recorded, and that resistance, when perfectly unified, may become an unbreakable, eternal resonance. The story serves as a stark warning about the power of official narratives to silence the undocumented, and the danger of dismissing the human capacity for spiritual and physical defiance. The triplets' legacy is not sorrow, but a profound, unnerving reassurance that the truth, when denied expression in one form, will find a more potent, more persistent form of its own. The final, unsettling reflection is this: if a historical atrocity can be so devastating that it leaves behind a physical, low-frequency hum, an acoustic scar that refuses to fade, what other hidden truths, what other enduring acts of silent, perfect defiance are currently vibrating beneath the ordered surface of our own documented history? We may have judged the master and burned the house, but we still stand on the very ground he corrupted. Can we ever truly claim silence? Or is the sound of the triplets still waiting for us to listen? The story of Hollow Creek reminds us that history is not defined by what is written, but by what refuses to be silenced.